We have what is now back up in a major hurricane category. It's grown from a 2 to 3 just with the 11 o'clock Eastern Time advisory. We have a major storm clawing its way up the eastern seaboard, but we must, in this new reality, counterbalance that against a major slight as perceived by the president. Thus, look at what we're here talking about.
Well, that's right. And, you know, I thought you were right to put the Tim Apple example up there. That's another good example when the president says something that is caught on tape, that is clearly, you know, in the record, and then denies, you know, what you've seen and heard. And he lives within his own reality at times, and he refuses to back down in the face of obvious evidence to the contrary. There's even reporting by my own paper at some point that he expressed to people that it wasn't really him on that Access Hollywood tape before the election. There have been other examples, like when he called Meghan Markle, the Duchess in England, nasty, and it was on tape, but he said no, he didn't, and the tape had to be played, and it showed that he did. His record through business and politics is never back down, never apologize, never give in. And if you simply continue to insist that you got it right, you know, a lot of people are going to believe you, and a lot of people aren't going to believe the media, which has a, he's helped create a credibility problem.
Tom, you spend your days in the most serious realm of all of us, really at the adult table at the War College. What do you reckon our allies and or adversaries make of what they're seeing if they're getting a feed of this broadcast or any other tonight?
Well, important to point out, I don't speak for the War College. I think one of the problems, as Peter said, is that the president creates his own reality and he starts to believe in it. And that means several things. First of all, I always pity the people who have to brief him and have to explain whether it's anything from enemy troop movements to trade policy to climate negotiations. Anybody who has to brief him clearly has a mountain to climb because he simply is not capable of processing information. And I think it's when you're an ally, it means you're not going to get very far in negotiation, that it's not really a discussion. And if you're an opponent, then that really opens the possibility to you of trying to create the president's reality for him. And to work with that and to try and get inside his mind about it and work with that rather than understand that you're dealing with a group of people who are directing a particular policy toward a particular goal. So as you understand the reality the president lives in, you've got a leg up against the United States.
So, Kim, do you see this real or perceived correlation between the story that his schedule has gotten significantly lighter as his presidency has gone on and this world we're living in and covering tonight?
I don't know, because there's plenty on his plate right now for him to be dealing with while he's still insisting that Alabama is in the path of is in a storm's path. I mean, one reason we're seeing the National Weather Service repeatedly, they did again today, say that Alabama is not in danger is because it's the job of the National Weather Service to alert the public about really dangerous situations. This storm, as it goes up the East Coast, can be deadly. They don't want people in Alabama worrying about it. They need to make sure that the people in Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and up the coast are taking them seriously and can believe what they say. So there are real consequences to what the president is saying and doing here. And again, we have seen the president double down on statements that he's made for no particular reason. I mean, let's remember, there is really no gain here for him to make by insisting that Alabama is in the path of a storm. It's just to save face. We've seen since his book, The Art of the Deal, the ghostwriter, the co-writer of that book, someone who the president doesn't even like to acknowledge he had a ghostwriter, right? But he said he just refused to admit failure. Refused to admit a mistake because he thought it was weak. He sees that he would see it as weakness to accept a basic fact that the hurricane is now on a path nowhere near Alabama, than to think about the fact that there are people in the path of danger that the U.S. should be playing some sort of role in, for example, giving aid to the Bahamas, which was absolutely decimated by this storm. Instead, we're talking about this Sharpie and this lie because that's where we are.
Yeah, I hope the U.S. Coast Guard, by the way, does the job in the Bahamas that they did after Katrina, because it made every American proud, and there are neighbors offshore just 50 miles. John Howman, the words meta and meme, it seems to me, had gone into word retirement before the internet age, but they're back with a vengeance. While you never, trust me, want to be a meme, there's nothing quite like the explosion of memes. Our hats off to a woman named Jane on Twitter tonight who has given us an alternate version with Sharpie of the cone of uncertainty map of this hurricane. John, what is it we are covering here this evening?
I'm a big fan of memetics. I've never met a meta I didn't love. I want to say, hearing you do Huntsville, Alabama, the weather, WAFF, the NBC affiliate, Tennessee Valley's first alert breaking news and weather center. I hear they're looking for a weatherman. You were great. I mean, you like natural for
Thanks.
that.
I'll keep it in my back pocket.
I also want to talk about protuberances because it's an awesome word, and it leads me to the word of the night for me, which is another P word, which is pathological. The president is pathological. I never thought I'd say that. I've covered a lot of presidents, as have you. I never thought I would go on television and say the president of the United States is pathological, but this president is pathological. He's a pathological liar. He cannot stop lying. He lies about important things. He lies about trivial things. He lies in places where you can totally understand why he's lying. You know, he wants to prop up the stock market, so he lies about a call from Chinese officials on trade that never happened. I understand why he does that. It doesn't make it okay, but I get it. This is a thing where when they first said the Alabama thing the first time, if someone had called him on it, he'd said, hey, I got confused. Sorry, Alabama's not in that. That was my mistake, my bad. No one, even the worst Trump haters, would have cut him some slack. People make mistakes, right? But instead, he's not just lying about it over and over and over again. You know, with the projection of this new map, with the argument today on camera that 95%, he's laying statistics on the line. 95% likelihood that Alabama was going to be in the hurricane's path, when we know for a fact that there was a 0% chance, or a less than statistically significant, maybe a little above zero chance. The only way to explain it is pathology, right? And there's lots of other ways to go around about it, but it is the case. You know, you could say he doesn't like to back down. You can say he never missed a feed, all that stuff. But he's pathological. It's a tick. Lying for him is as like you taking breath.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.